The history books have sold you a sanitized, perfumed version of Marcus Aurelius that simply never existed. They want you to believe he was a serene philosopher king floating through marble hallways, whispering sweet platitudes about inner peace, while the sun set beautifully over the 7 hills. That is a convenient, hollow myth, constructed to make his wisdom feel safe for the modern boardroom. The reality of 169 AD was a slaughterhouse. Marcus wasn't sitting in a library. He was squatting in a damp leather tent on the edge of the known world, the air thick with the metallic stench of gangrene and the charcoal smoke of funeral pyres that never stopped burning. He wasn't writing a self-help book for your morning routine. He was writing a survival manual for a man who was being hunted by every force the universe could throw at him. The Roman Empire in 169 AD was no longer the apex predator of the Mediterranean. It had become a massive, bloated carcass, and the wolves of the north had finally smelled the rot. Across the Danube, the Germanic tribes, the Marcomanni and the Quadi, weren't just raiding, they were migrating, driven by a primal hunger to devour everything the legions protected. The clock started ticking the moment the ice on the river began to melt. This was the Great Northern War, a 17-year meat grinder that would consume the rest of Marcus's life. You can see it in the physical toll. His skin grew sallow, his hair thinned to white wisps, and his stomach was so ravaged by stress and the Antonine Plague that he could barely keep down a crust of bread. He was the most powerful man on earth, yet he lived like a prisoner of war in his own command center. Look at his hands. They aren't clean. In the flickering light of a tallow candle, he grips a reed pen with knuckles scarred by the cold of the Pannonian winter. Outside that tent, 40,000 men are waiting for him to tell them how to die effectively. The ground beneath his boots is a slush of mud and frozen blood. This is the predator and prey dynamic in its purest, most terrifying form. If Marcus flinches, the empire vanishes. If he lets his mind wander to the comforts of Rome, the Germanic axe finds his neck. Every word he scratched onto those scrolls was a defensive wall built against the predator of his own despair. He was fighting a war on 2 fronts, one against the barbarians at the gate, and one against the crushing realization that he was losing everything he loved. The plague was the silent hunter stalking the camp. It didn't care about rank or virtue. It turned the lungs of elite centurions into black bile. You're going to want to know how he managed to look into the eyes of 10,000 dying men and still find the strength to keep the line from breaking. Subscribe so you don't miss the moment we expose the actual cost of his endurance. The system tells you that Stoicism is about being calm, but the truth is much darker. It's about being the only thing in the room that the predator is afraid of. The countdown to the end of the Roman world didn't happen in a single collapse. It happened in the seconds between Marcus's heartbeats. By 170 AD, the situation turned from desperate to catastrophic. The barbarians had breached the Alps. They were on Italian soil for the first time in centuries. The Roman treasury was empty. To fund the defense, Marcus didn't raise taxes. He stood in the forum and auctioned off the imperial family's jewelry, their silk robes, and their golden goblets. He stripped the palace bare to buy iron for swords. He was no longer a king. He was a desperate gambler, betting his life against a ticking clock. He watched his children die, one by one, taken by the same fever that was liquefying his army. He had to bury them and then immediately return to his maps, calculating how many more lives he had to trade for another week of survival. The Mediterranean world was shrinking. The maps were being redrawn in red. Every night, The howling of the wolves outside the camp was answered by the coughing of the sick inside. There was nowhere to hide. You either became the hunter of your own fears, or you became the prey of the chaos. Marcus chose to be the hunter. He chose to look at the abyss and document exactly what it felt like to hold it back, with nothing but a crumbling empire and a few sheets of papyrus. Follow the blood trail through the mud, and you'll see that the meditations weren't a choice. They were a desperate last-ditch effort to keep a mind from shattering under the weight of a world that had already decided to end. The smell of Rome in 170 AD wasn't the scent of incense or roasting meat anymore. It was the stench of vinegar and rotting flesh. Imagine standing in the Subura, the most crowded district in the world, and hearing nothing but the rhythmic thumping of wooden cartwheels on basalt paving stones. Those carts weren't carrying grain. They were stacked high with the blue-gray corpses of people who had been healthy 48 hours prior. This was the Antonine Plague, a biological sledgehammer that didn't care about your status or your prayers. You look at your screen today and complain about a slow internet connection or a cold coffee. But Marcus Aurelius was watching the very tax base of his civilization liquefy into black pustules. The ticking clock wasn't a metaphor. It was the sound of shovels hitting the dirt over and over until there was no more room to bury the dead. Every person who died was a gap in the phalanx. Every farmer who succumbed was a field that wouldn't be harvested. The empire was an organism, and it was experiencing multi-organ failure. Don't kid yourself into thinking he was some serene monk sitting on a marble throne. He was a man drowning in logistics. Look closely at the coins minted during this era. The silver content drops. The faces of the gods look more haggard. He wasn't just fighting a war against the Marcomanni on the frozen banks of the Danube. He was fighting a war against the total collapse of the Roman currency. He stood in the cold, wet mud of Pannonia, his boots soaked through, his joints screaming with a chronic pain he couldn't escape. And he had to decide which province to abandon, so another might live. There were no good choices. There were only degrees of catastrophe. You think you're stressed? Try balancing the ledger of a continent while your own lungs are burning with the same fever that killed your children. The meditations weren't written for an audience. They were scribbled in the middle of the night by the light of a guttering tallow lamp, while the screams of wounded men drifted in from the camp hospital. It was a psychic tourniquet. He was bleeding out, and he used logic to stop the flow. Follow the supply lines. They lead back to a Rome that was cannibalizing itself. To keep the army paid, Marcus had to strip the gold leaf off the statues of his own ancestors. This wasn't a symbolic gesture. It was a brutal, physical necessity. He watched the silk robes of his wife being carried off by merchants to pay for iron and leather. He was dismantling the prestige of the monarchy to preserve the reality of the borders. The clock was ticking louder now. On the northern front, the Germanic tribes weren't just raiding, they were migrating. They were pushed by a climate shift and a pressure from the east that made them desperate. They looked at the Roman line and saw a wall of shields held by men who were coughing up blood. The myth of Roman invincibility was evaporating in the winter mist. Marcus didn't have the luxury of hope. Hope is a drug for the weak. He had something better. He had a cold, calculated indifference to his own suffering. Look at his hands in the flickering candlelight. They are scarred, stained with ink, and perhaps the blood of a horse he had to put down. He writes that life is a warfare and a stranger's sojourn. He wasn't being poetic. He was describing his literal daily routine. He hadn't seen the sun in weeks, only the gray, oppressive sky of the northern frontier. His body was failing him. His stomach was a knotted mass of ulcers. He survived on a mixture of wine and theriac, an opiate-heavy concoction that was the only thing keeping his mind from shattering under the physical agony. But he didn't dull his senses to escape. He sharpened them to endure. That is the secret the history books won't tell you. Stoicism isn't a shield, it's a whetstone. It makes the soul sharp enough to cut through the bullshit of fate. The reality of his situation would have driven a lesser man to madness or suicide. He had the power of a god and the life of a slave to duty. The countdown was reaching its final seconds. By 180 AD, the man who had held the world together was nothing more than a skeleton wrapped in purple wool. He was at Vindobona, modern-day Vienna. The air was thick with the smell of wet pine and wood smoke. He knew he was dying. He could feel his heart stuttering, a machine that had been run too hard for too long. He didn't ask for a priest. He didn't ask for more time. He looked at the soldiers standing outside his tent, men who had followed him into the mouth of hell, and he gave them one final command. He told them to go and look at the rising sun and remember that they were part of something larger than their own fear. He wasn't talking about Rome. He was talking about the universe. He was teaching them how to die without flinching. The empire didn't fall the day Marcus Aurelius died, but the light went out. The clock hit zero. What followed was a century of chaos, of barracks, emperors, and hyperinflation. But for a brief moment, the entire weight of Western civilization rested on the shoulders of one man who refused to break. You look in the mirror, and you see someone burdened by modern trivialities. Marcus would look at you and wonder why you're wasting your breath complaining when you could be sharpening your mind for the next strike of the hammer. The Meditations are a message in a bottle sent from the heart of a collapsing world. They tell us that you can't control the plague, you can't control the barbarians, and you certainly can't control the ticking of the clock. The only thing you own is the space between your ears. If you lose that, you lose everything. If you hold it, you are an empire of one, even when the world around you is turning to ash. The truth is that we are all living in a countdown. Your time, your health, your world, it's all eroding. Marcus Aurelius didn't write to be remembered. He wrote to survive the next 10 minutes. He didn't want your admiration. He wanted you to wake up. Every sentence he left behind is a slap in the face to our modern fragility. He lived in the mud, so we could understand that the soul doesn't need a palace to be noble. It just needs a refusal to lie to itself. As the campfires dimmed and the Germanic tribes gathered in the dark, Marcus Aurelius closed his eyes for the last time. He didn't leave behind a kingdom of gold. He left behind a blueprint for how to stand tall when the sky is falling. The clock has been ticking since the moment you started listening to this. The question isn't how much time you have left. The question is what you're going to do with the seconds that remain before the dark finally moves in. Follow the trail of his blood through the snow and realize that the only thing standing between you and the chaos is the discipline you forge in the fire of your own suffering. There is no other way out. There is only through. The snow didn't stop falling on the day Commodus took the purple. It settled on the rusted mail of the Danubian legions, a white shroud for an empire that didn't yet know it was dead. Marcus Aurelius was barely cold in his grave before the philosophy of the porch was traded for the blood of the arena. You see, the transition wasn't a slow fade. It was a violent snap. Commodus didn't want to be a philosopher king. He wanted to be Hercules. He stepped into the Colosseum, smelling of expensive oils and sweat, and slaughtered wounded soldiers and animals while the plebeians cheered. This is the first tick of the clock, when the leadership stops looking at the horizon and starts looking into a mirror. The countdown has already begun. Look at the marble statues of that era. Notice how the eyes shift from the stoic, distant gaze of Marcus to the bulging, paranoid stares of the men who followed him. They knew the floor was rotting. They just hoped it wouldn't give way while they were standing on it. The silver tells the real story. Hold a denarius from the reign of Augustus in your hand, and you feel the weight of a world superpower. It's nearly pure. Now, watch the metal change as the years scream by. By the time the 3rd century crisis hits, that coin is a ghost. It's a piece of copper washed in a thin, pathetic layer of silver that rubs off after a week in a merchant's palm. The Roman government was lying to its people's faces, pretending the money was real while the economy turned into a house of cards. They weren't just debasing the currency, they were debasing the truth. Prices skyrocketed. Bread became a luxury. The soldiers demanded more gold to keep the barbarians at bay, but the gold was gone. Follow the money, and you'll find the jagged edges of a collapsing civilization every single time. It wasn't the Goths who broke Rome first. It was the lack of integrity in the very metal they used to trade for their lives. This is the reality of the countdown. First the spirit breaks, then the coin, then the border. The plague didn't care about your rank or your lineage. It moved through the narrow, feces-slicked streets of Rome like a silent shadow. People woke up with black boils in their armpits and were dead by sunset. The stench of rotting bodies became the permanent perfume of the capital. Physical reality was a nightmare that no amount of incense could drown out. The temples were packed with terrified citizens begging gods who had clearly checked out. While the elite hid in their villas, the machinery of the state began to grind and seize. Taxes couldn't be collected from corpses. Fields went fallow because the farmers were being shoveled into mass graves. You think your modern comforts are permanent? Look at the empty villas of the Palatine Hill. Look at the overgrown roads where the mail once traveled with lightning speed. The system is a living organism, and when the blood stops flowing, the limbs start to turn black. The truth is that you are currently standing on the same tectonic plates of history that swallowed the Caesars. Subscribe to see how deep the rabbit hole really goes, because the patterns are repeating, and most people are too distracted by the circus to see the fire in the stands. Listen to the sound of the hammers. In the forests of Germania, the tribes weren't just waiting, they were learning. They watched the Roman fortifications crumble. They saw the sentries getting older, lazier, and more corrupt. The iron of the Roman gladius, once the most feared object in the known world, was being held by men who hadn't been paid in months. Desertion wasn't a choice, it was a survival strategy. The countdown was reaching its final minutes. Every time an emperor was murdered by his own Praetorian Guard, which happened with the sickening frequency of a heartbeat, the clock ticked closer to midnight. These weren't political shifts. They were tremors before the volcano. Rome became a revolving door of barracks emperors, men who seized power with a bloody sword, only to be cut down by the next man in line. There was no plan. There was only the frantic, sweaty grab for power before the lights went out. The physical world always reflects the internal rot. If you walked through Rome in the year 250, you wouldn't see a glorious capital. You would see crumbling aqueducts. You would see walls being built out of salvaged tombstones because there wasn't enough time or money to quarry new rock. The city was eating its own history just to stay upright. The scale of the disaster is etched into the very stones of the Aurelian walls. They are a desperate, jagged circle of brick and concrete thrown up in a panic because the barbarians weren't just at the gates. They were inside the house. Stop lying to yourself about the stability of the world you see through your window. The Roman citizen also thought the sun would always rise on a city of marble. He was wrong. The sun rose on a city of ruins and a population that had forgotten how to build the very things that kept them alive. The final tick of the clock isn't a bang. It's the sound of a gate creaking open because there's no one left to guard it. It's the sight of a library being burned to keep a shivering soldier warm for one more night. The Roman Empire didn't vanish. It disintegrated. It returned to the mud and the dark from which it was forged. Marcus Aurelius warned us. He told us that everything is in flux, that the world is change, and life is but what you deem it. But we didn't listen. We preferred the lies of the amphitheater and the debased silver of the emperors. Now, the snow is falling again. The shadows of the Germanic forests are stretching across the modern world. You can hear the ticking if you're quiet enough. The only question that remains is whether you will be found standing like a statue among the ruins, or if you'll be swept away in the first gust of the coming storm. The countdown is at 0. Look around you. The collapse isn't coming. It's already here, hidden under the thin silver plating of a world that's forgotten its own weight. Hold your ground. Refuse the easy lie. There is no other way to survive the dark. The predator doesn't announce its arrival with a roar. It waits for the moment you finally convince yourself that you are safe. Look at the way the light catches the dust motes in your living room. It seems peaceful, almost eternal. But outside that window, the geography of the hunt has already shifted. The supply lines are snapping like frozen brittle in the cold. Those grocery store shelves you rely on aren't just empty spaces. They are the skeletal remains of a logistics god that died while we were busy staring at our own reflections. In the year 260, a merchant in Ephesus likely felt that same phantom peace. He held a coin that looked like silver, but felt like tin, watching the horizon for a ship that would never dock. He didn't realize he had already transitioned from a citizen to a calorie count. The state, once a protective shell, had calcified into a predatory apparatus that viewed its own people as a resource to be harvested until the marrow was dry. We are repeating the cycle with terrifying precision. You can see it in the way the city's centers are being hollowed out, replaced by the flickering cold blue light of server farms that eat more electricity than the neighborhoods they've displaced. Every interaction you have today is a tactical maneuver in a landscape where someone is always the wolf and someone is always the lamb. We've traded the gladiatorial arena for the digital panopticon, but the stakes are identical. Blood is still the only currency the system truly respects. The Roman wolf wasn't a metaphor carved into a shield. It was a hungry, lean animal that eventually turned its teeth on its own litter. When the currency was debased, it wasn't just an economic shift, it was a physical betrayal. Imagine holding a handful of coins that are supposed to buy a year's worth of grain, only to realize they are worth less than the dirt they're sitting on. You feel the weight of that lie in your palm. It's the same weight you feel today when you look at a medical bill or a rent increase that defies the laws of physics. The walls are closing in, and the space left for the prey is shrinking by the hour. The predator thrives in the chaos of the collapse, because that's when the prey is most distracted by its own panic. We are
this
currently
house,
in the
you
stage
must
where the
stop
hunters
lying
are
yourself
putting on the
stability.
masks of protectors. They tell you the walls are for your
Stoicism
safety,
isn't a shield.
while they use the
It's a
stones
whetstone
to
that
build a
makes the
cage.
soul sharp
If you
enough to
listen
cut.
closely, you can hear the grinding of the gears, the sound of a world that has run out of oil and is now running on friction. The machinery of our civilization is screaming, yet we've been trained to hear it as music. The final stage of the hunt is always the quietest. It's the silence that follows the exhaustion. You can see it in the eyes of the people on the subway, staring into the middle distance with a hollowed-out expression that Marcus Aurelius would have recognized instantly. They are waiting for the blow to fall. They are waiting for the lights to go out and stay out. The concrete beneath your feet is already cracking, and the weeds pushing through those cracks aren't just plants. They are the fingers of the earth reclaiming what was stolen. We built a world of glass and expected it to hold back the tide of history. What a pathetic delusion. We are the prey that forgot how to run. The hunters who forgot that eventually everything gets hunted. The countdown has reached the final digits. The numbers are blurring. You're standing in the middle of a clearing, and the shadows at the edge of the woods have started to move. Perhaps you think you can outrun the dark, or maybe you simply want to see exactly how long the fuse is before the spark reaches the powder. If your curiosity is stronger than your fear, hit subscribe, because the descent is far from over, and the view from the edge is the only truth left. But don't expect a hand to pull you back. The momentum is too great now. The gravity of our own failures is pulling us into the dirt. And there is a certain grim irony in the way we've polished the floor just to make the slide faster. It is what it is, and we brought it upon ourselves. The red digital clock atop the central bank isn't just counting seconds anymore. It is measuring the remaining oxygen in the room. You can see it in the way the morning mist clings to the empty skyscrapers, turning steel and glass into ghost ships anchored in a sea of cracked asphalt. The predator has finished its meal, and now it is simply cleaning its teeth with the fragments of our shattered institutions. We were never the apex. We were just the most sophisticated livestock ever bred, conditioned to believe that a paycheck was a shield and a suburban fence was a fortress. Look at the way the sunlight hits the dust motes in your living room. Those tiny specks are the pulverized remains of a dream that required infinite growth on a finite planet. A dream that is currently being inhaled by the very people who were sold the nightmare. The machinery does not need to stop for the world to end. It just needs to keep grinding until there is nothing left to consume but the gears themselves. You are watching the final frame of a film where the hero never showed up because he was too busy checking his stock portfolio while the theater burned. The weight of this realization is like a lead blanket being slowly pulled over a sleeping city. The predator isn't some external monster from a dark, mythical forest. It is the very logic of the world we built, a logic that demands a brutal sacrifice for every ounce of comfort we stole from the future. The debt collectors are at the door, and they do not take cash. They take existence. They are the shadows flickering in the corner of your eye, the ones you've been told to ignore by every flickering screen in your house. The truth is that the hunt didn't happen in the woods. It happened in the spreadsheets and the legal fine print that stripped you of your autonomy before you were even old enough to vote. We are standing on a pier made of rotting wood, watching the tide go out much further than it should. Yet we still stand there admiring the seashells. The wave is coming, and it is taller than the buildings we used to worship. It carries with it the debris of every lie we told ourselves about progress and security. Notice the way the birds have stopped singing in the parks. They know the difference between a sunset and a blackout. The hunters have retreated to their bunkers leaving the prey to argue over the scraps of a dead ideology. This is the moment where the countdown hits zero, and the sound of the world isn't a bang, but the dry click of an empty holster. You might think there is a way to negotiate with the gravity of a collapsing star, but physics doesn't take bribes. This channel isn't for everyone. If you are easily offended by the sight of the truth without its makeup on, or if you still believe a political savior is coming to reset the clock for you, do not subscribe. We aren't here to offer the warm milk of hope. We are here to map the wreckage for those few who prefer to face the void with their eyes wide open and their spines straight. The countdown has finished, and the silence that follows is the only honest